how can the word of the day and the Marilyn Initiative techniques help with anxiety? In a number of ways. Well, let's make a distinction first of all. So anxiety is a fear of something that might or might not happen. And fear is a biological response to something that could put you in danger. Now, the third distinction is that worry and anxiety often dance together, and that's a problem too. We have to start to become more aware of our feelings on a subtle level. And one of the things that the hug does is it just flips you out of this anxiety state that we often find ourselves. Because I have to tell you something, I've wrestled with anxiety all my life. I no longer do. And why? Because I figured out that it was basically a bad habit. I'm going to repeat that. Many of our patterns of thinking are merely bad habits. They are things we are taught are good, and they're not good. And so when we do them, we feel terrible. But when we stop doing them, that self-esteem model of should I just kicks in, and we're like, oh my God, well, if I'm not anxious, something's wrong. We're so used to it, right? The story I will tell you to illustrate this is I had a student who had a wasting disease called lupus. And she was constantly in a state of worry. And take it as a metaphor for whatever we're worried about. And we did all kinds of techniques, and I could never get her to really totally relax and commit to her work. And I have a pretty much of 100% success rate. And I'm like, well, evidently I don't. What am I doing wrong? So we walked out to her car, and on the back of her car, on her vanity license plate, it said lupus. And I realized at that moment that she was so attached to her disease that nothing would ever make her change. Okay, I tried something else. She finished her screenplay. It was all good. But my point in telling you the story is that very often, because of how things go, you're diagnosed as having an anxiety disorder. And so that becomes part of your identity, and you get validation from people, feel understood in that framework that you have an anxiety problem. The alternative to being anxious is you acknowledge the feeling, and then you rationally make a determination of the fear level. If you're being chased by a bear, you're not anxious, you're scared, okay? But if you're worried about being late for an appointment, you're anxious, okay? And the good news or the bad news is if you're going to be late, you're going to be late. But then at least you can have a rational conversation with yourself and say, okay, what do I need to do in order to have this not happen anymore? And at that point, you get practical solutions, and practical solutions reduce anxiety. All right, a lot of anxiety I have found as a practical matter, not as a psychological assessment, is the result of helplessness. And helplessness or powerlessness is also a learned response that we are often taught. Beyond that, when we are frightened, all of our cortisol levels and our stress goes up, and we generally have one of three responses. We freeze, we fight, or we flee. And when you're in that state, you can't reason. So one of the reasons that anxiety is hard to deal with is because your body does not make a distinction about what is a real danger, as I said, fear, and the fear of a perceived danger. So the first step in the Marilyn system is to do the hug, because the hug helps you find a baseline where you are happy and you are not in a stress mode. When you say, I love you, we'll always be together, we'll always be safe, we are enough, and thank yourself for being there. And breathe, it sends a shot of dopamine to your brain, you calm down. At that moment, if you're really on the case and you want to start to correct anxiety, you immediately say to yourself, and you do a cluster on anxiety or whatever the word is, what am I anxious about? You let the things come up, and then you write about them for a couple of minutes, and then you give yourself a hug and you read what you've written, and you may surprise yourself at how lucid your creative unconscious is in saying, yeah, you have no reason to be scared or something. You'll read things, you'll write things to yourself that will really help you start to unpack the process. So if we accept that the feeling might be the same, it might be fear or anxiety, but because of the way we're trained, we are unable to distinguish what the actual fear danger is, what the actual danger is, then you start to see that you have a real place to work. And the way to start working is you find a baseline where you feel good. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but it works. And once you feel good, you examine something that is causing you fear/anxiety. And there, if you're in a happy state, you can make a rational determination of what you need to do to repair the situation, lower your anxiety, or cure the fear. And then once you know that, you start to do that every time you have the same feeling. You do the hug, You remember what you came up with as a rationale, and you start to gently, over time, repattern yourself to becoming a person who reacts to fear and anxiety calmly. Now, this is simple, it's not easy, and that's why I always recommend that people make this a regular practice. So if you're enjoying this material, please join me on social media, come to a free webinar, and sign up for the newsletter. We have tips and tricks, among other things, about how to be less anxious.